we're going to get started. And so we're going to do the muscular system today, all in one day. Shabam. All right. So what does muscle do? Let's just kind of think of the function of muscle for a second. And I know you're like, oh, duh. But there's a few things that you might not have thought of. So what's the easy answer to this question? Movement, right? So movement of the skeleton, that would be our skeletal muscle, but also movement of some other things like moving food through the digestive system, right? So we have muscle in the walls of our esophagus, stomach, intestines, right? Where else? And in the heart, right? So pumping the blood. So muscle is moving our food through our digestive system and is moving our blood through our circulatory system, and it's moving the parts of our skeleton around. What else does muscle do for us? Say that again? Yeah, it adds a layer of protection, right? So it helps protect our bones, right? And it also helps protect squishy bits, right? If somebody's going to punch you in the gut, right, you tense up your muscles, right? So that it doesn't do as much damage. And it's also actually our meat cage, our muscles and bones that hold all our parts inside of our abdomen, okay? So we don't have any bones up here, so it's just the muscles keeping my intestines from sagging out, right? Your skin is not strong enough to keep all that stuff in. All right, what else can muscle do for us if we need it to? This is something that I experience in the evenings if I sit down with my family to watch Schitt's Creek. I'm sitting there, not moving on the couch. I start to get a little chilly. I have to pull on the blanket, right? Because what else does muscle do? Generates heat, right? So if you're cold, you start shivering, right? Your muscles start contracting to generate heat, right? So muscle actually does quite a few things for us, right? Allows us to be upright along in concert, right, in conjunction with our skeleton. Movement of all the different types we discussed. Produces heat, right? It helps warm the body. Circulates the blood, right? So not only the heart, but remember too the skeletal muscle pump. When we're talking about veins and how blood in the veins gets back up to the heart, when muscles squeeze the veins, it kind of pushes the blood back because those valves make it a one-way system, right? So it helps bring blood from the veins back toward the heart when our muscles contract, right? And then, of course, it protects and stabilizes things. Right? For example, the shoulder joint is largely kept from dislocating by the muscles that surround it. Those muscles are called the rotator cuff. So you've heard about a rotator cuff injury. That's what they're talking about. So muscle does lots of things. It's not just the dumb jock of the body. It does lots of things besides movement. So types of muscle. So we're going to go through this relatively quickly. This is a review from way back in the beginning of the semester when we learned about different tissue types. So you may remember there are 3 types of muscle, right? So like 3 amigos. So we have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. We're going to run through them one by one really quickly. Skeletal muscle, long tube-shaped cylindrical cells, right? They're striated, they have that striped appearance, they have multiple nuclei, and they pull on bones. Makes sense, skeletal muscle. They are voluntary, right? We consciously choose to move these muscles. So that's skeletal muscle. Number 2 is cardiac muscle. So this is also striated or striped. They're somewhat cylindrical, but they're shorter and they're branching. And then they have these little intercalated discs that attach one to another to keep it nice and strong and really knit strongly together. So as our heart is pumping forcefully, we don't have to worry about the muscles splitting open. Now, cardiac muscle is striated. It only has 1 or 2 nuclei per cell, whereas skeletal muscle has many nuclei per cell. And of course, cardiac muscle is involuntary, right? Thank goodness I don't have to say to my heart, okay, now beat. Okay, beat again, right? I could never sleep. It would be terrible. But the interesting thing about this is that it is autorhythmic. So cardiac muscle just has its own internal beat. It's just going to contract on its own, whether anything in your body tells it to or not. And I don't know if I can make this work. So, nothing like, waiting till the day of to like experiment with embedding video. All right. And then finally, we have smooth muscle. So smooth muscle doesn't have stripes or it's not striated. It's involuntary, right? I don't have to really think about my intestines pushing food through them. It's found in the walls of the digestive system, also in the wall of the bladder, you'll remember. And it has these spindle-shaped cells with a single nucleus. So those are our three different types of muscle tissue. We're going to talk almost exclusively today about skeletal muscle. That's the one you have the most direct experience with. So that's mostly what we're going to talk about. Here is smooth muscle in action. So this is a video where with a video camera inside somebody's stomach, and we're going to see a wave of peristalsis that, if there were food in the stomach, would be pushing it down through the system. Let's see if I can just... Yes. So it's constantly happening, right? Pretty neat. Okay, so skeletal muscle, right, is the muscle that attaches to bones and is going to pull on it in order to produce movement of the skeleton. Makes sense. So a couple of important things. When a muscle attaches to a bone, this is dense, regular connective tissue. So thinking back to our tissue types, that's where you have multiple collagen fibers all arranged in parallel, right? So that's a tendon that attaches a muscle to a bone. So tendons attach muscles to bones. Ligaments are also dense, regular connective tissue, but they attach bone to bone. Right? So tendons are how the muscles attach to bones so they can pull on them to cause movement. Ligaments attach bone to bone to give stability to that area, which is usually a joint, right? It's vulnerable to things falling apart or getting knocked out of alignment. Just keep that in mind. So skeletal muscle, if it's going to move something, right, if I pull from here to here, nothing's going to happen. That's all a bone, right? So I need to cross a joint in order to be able to cause movement to happen. So skeletal muscle almost always crosses a joint. The exceptions are the ones that like move your face, right? They're just attached to the skin. They usually attach across a joint. So you have the muscles attached, in this case, to the shin bone here, crosses the ankle, and then attaches down here onto the heel bone, right? So if I'm going to activate my calf muscle here, my gastrocnemius muscle, my calf muscle, or my shin bone, my tibia is going to stay still, but I'm going to pull up my heel bone, right? So usually one stays relatively stationary and the other one moves because I pull on it. All right. So it's really important to acknowledge that skeletal muscles, because of the way they work, we're going to talk about this, they cannot push a bone. They can only pull on a bone. Okay? Muscles can only shorten with force. You're like, well, then how do I push things? We'll get there. Okay? Right? You can only pull on a bone. Right? So here's this muscle here. If I shorten it, I pull on my heel bone, right? And end up pointing my foot, end up moving the ankle this way. If I want to move my ankle the other way, I'm going to have to activate this muscle on the front side of my tibia or my shin bone to pull my foot up this way, right? So my calf muscle will pull it this way, and my muscle here on the front of my tibia will pull it that way. Okay? Muscles cannot push a bone. We can push an object by causing a series of different movements of our bones by pulling on different bones. But muscles can't push a bone. They can only pull. So because of that, every muscle needs to have a counterpart. So we call these antagonistic pairs. To antagonize something means to work against it, right? An antagonist is like an enemy. So my biceps muscle will pull this way, right? That's called flexing the elbow, if you remember from last time. My triceps muscle comes this way, attaches here. So if I shorten, when it pulls on that bone, it ends up straightening the elbow or extending the elbow. So my biceps pulls to flex the elbow. My triceps pulls to extend the elbow. So we have these antagonistic muscle pairs all over the place so that we can move the joints in different directions. Right? So your quadriceps muscle group here, your quads, if they come from your thigh and they down and the tendon attaches onto the shin bone here. I know, hold on to something on wheels. That's smart. Okay. So if I shorten this, I pull, right? That extends, straightens my knee. The muscle back here attaches down here. If I pull, that flexes or bends my knee. Right? So we have all these antagonistic muscle pairs that are usually on the opposite sides of each other, right? My calf muscle does this, the muscle on the front does this, called the tibialis anterior. I have muscles here in this part of my forearm that do this, and in order to straighten my fingers, I have muscles on the other side that extend them. Okay? So take a look at your hand and extend your fingers, straighten them. And see those tendons popping up? If you really do it hard, right? Those muscles that extend your fingers are located on this side of your forearm. Now, turn it over. Now, unless you're like old like me, it's hard to actually see the tendons. So what I'm going to have you do is make a fist and then push. Bite yourself to make the tendons kind of pop out a little bit. Right? So the muscles that flex your fingers and wrists, that bend them, are located on this side of the forearm. Because muscles can only pull. They can't push. All right. And remember, flexion means bending the joint. If I'm talking about a muscle activating, I use the word contraction. Right? That's a muscular contraction. I'm not flexing the muscle. I contract a muscle. Flexion is a movement. All right. As opposed to extension. So again, flexion, bending, extension, straightening. We have a couple of other ways that we describe movements that we can do, right? So first of all, for the hip, this is flexion, this is extension. For the head, flexion, extension. With my arms and legs, my upper and lower extremities, I can also do different things, right? I can move them away from my body, and I can move them toward. If I move them away, I use the prefix AB, ab. That's called abduction, leading away. So think AB as an absent, moving away from. Or I can pull them back in, and that's called adduction, adduction, leading them in. Think add, bringing something in, okay? I can do rotation, right, turning around an axis, or I can do circumduction. But some joints are pretty limited, right? My fingers, I can only flex and extend. That's pretty much it, right? Much more limited range of motion with certain joints compared to others. All right, so these are all the different movements that we can do, and for every different movement, you have a different muscle. So if my arm is out here and I want to bring it in here, I'm going to use my pec major to pull it in. If it's in here and I want to bring it out there, I'm going to use muscles back here on my scapula or shoulder blade to pull it back. Yeah?
What does it mean when somebody is like double jointed?
Oh, what does it mean when somebody is double jointed? It means that their joints are a lot looser than other people's, right? So they're kind of loosey-goosey. So usually that's because their ligaments aren't as tight. Other questions? Okay. All right. So we have all of these muscles to move all the different parts of our bodies in all the different directions. Okay. So there will be some questions on this week's quiz for you to kind of look at the diagrams and learn the names of some of these muscles. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today to go over it because it's kind of straightforward, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about muscles, and they're so interesting. All right, so I'll ask you to learn a few of those this week. Here's another diagram. I just thought it was a nice diagram. Okay. All right, just a reminder about joints, right? That's what allows for movement. So a place where two or more bones come together. Some of them move, some of them don't. But the synovial joints move quite freely. And just to remind you that this is an end of a bone, this is an end of a bone. So we have some hyaline cartilage, often called articular cartilage. Articular just means of the joint. That makes a smooth, slippery surface so that when we're moving those bones around, they glide, as well as synovial fluid inside the joint space here to help lubricate it, like WD-40. Keep everything nice and smooth. So just a reminder about those. And then when you injure a joint, usually that is what's called a sprain. Okay? So if you have an ankle sprain, right, most common is you kind of roll your ankle this way. What that does is that puts stress on these ligaments here that normally hold all these bones together and give stability to the ankle joint. Okay? So a sprain is injury to the ligaments. Most ankle sprains, you get a little bit of a tear in the ligament. It's not a full tear, right? The ligament is still intact, it's just damaged. And so what we do is we protect it while it knits back together. Kind of like how we use a cast for a broken bone, right? So we put an ACE wrap on it, or if it's more significant, we'll put somebody in one of those sports casts, or maybe even a walking boot, right? We want to immobilize it so that that tissue can knit back together and not hold on continually, right? We want to hold it still so it can knit back together. So the swelling and the bruising that can often happen with an ankle sprain is because this tissue actually tears and bleeds. And as those blood cells seep out into the tissues around it, you get all these lovely bruising colors. Okay? Yeah.
So maybe this is common, maybe it's not. I'm somebody who rolls my foot extremely often.
Yep.
It doesn't really feel strange. Does it just adjust over time?
Right. So what tends to happen if somebody has repeated sprains, right, is that it doesn't heal quite as tight as it was before. So then you're at increased risk of doing it again because you have a less stable ankle, right? And it can happen more and more. Sometimes it gets to be so much of a problem that then we do surgery to kind of tighten up those ligaments for folks. Yep. All right. A strain, however, is an injury to the muscle itself, right? It's a little partial muscle tear, usually to overworking or overloading the muscle. So those are kind of the two differences. Sprain is ligaments, a strain is the muscle tissue itself. All right. So how do muscles actually contract? How do they do their work? Okay, so that's what we're going to move into next, the actual process of muscular contraction. Oh, I meant to take that out. Forget that. All right. The first thing you need to know is that inside of a muscle cell are really important structures. So this is one skeletal muscle cell, right? That big long cylinder. This is just a section of it. And when you look inside, you find all of these little tubes, all of these little cylindrical structures. So I kind of made my own model here, right? So if this soda bottle is like the outside of my muscle cell, and that would continue on really long, it's filled with all these little stripy cylinders, okay? Each one of these little striped cylinders inside the muscle cell is called a myofibril. Myofibril, M-Y-O-F-I-B-R-I-L, okay? And that myofibril is a little cylinder made of bundles of special protein fibers. And so now we're going to kind of zoom in on that even further. So as we zoom in, this is now my myofibril, okay? So this is now representing one of these little cylinders inside the muscle cell. All right, so the myofibril itself has a striped appearance to it. So if you were looking at this from very far away, you would say, here's a dark section, here's a light section, here's a dark section. And the reason why it has that striped appearance is because of the pattern in which those protein filaments are arranged. Okay? So we have this very specific pattern of two different overlapping protein fibers. And that unit, that repeating unit that we see, is called a sarcomere. Sarcomere, S-A-R-C-O-M-E-R-E. So it's that sarcomere that's kind of the functional unit of the muscle cell. This is what's going to do the work of a contraction for us. So we're going to take a closer look now at one individual sarcomere, just between my fingers here. So there's two protein filaments that we're dealing with. The red one in the middle is thicker, and it's called myosin. M-Y-O-S-I-N, myosin. Then overlapping it a little bit are these thinner filaments or protein fibers called actin, A-C-T-I-N. And so we have this repeating pattern, right? And this continues the entire length of the myofibril, and the myofibrils extend the entire length of the muscle cell. So we have actin and myosin in this overlapping pattern. Okay, so how does this actually cause a contraction? Today is like arts and crafts day. I'll show you. All right. Oh, I usually hold this in my teeth. I'm sorry, I can't feel good. Okay. Oh, this is not gonna work. Okay.
Do you have a magnet? Could you put it on the whiteboard?
I don't have a magnet. That would be too clever. I have a piece of tape. All right. So you're just gonna have to imagine the other side because I only have two arms. Okay. Here's my myosin. Here's my actin. It's overlapping just a little bit. When it's time to contract, those little bulbs on the myosin are going to grab onto the actin and pull it in towards the center. When it's time to relax, it's going to let go, and it's going to slide back. Contraction, relaxation. So if you imagine this happening on the other side as well, the distance in between the ends of each sarcomere gets smaller. The fibers themselves don't change in length, but the length of the sarcomere decreases, right? Because it pulls it in on each side. It pulls it in on each side. No, there's no way I can do that with my hands. Okay. All right, so what we're seeing here in this image, here it's relaxed, right? So actin is sitting way out here, and then here it's contracted. These little doohickeys on the myosin pull the actin in, right? So it's almost now completely overlapping. So you go from like this to like this. And when that happens, since the sarcomere shortens, and the sarcomeres repeat all along the length of the myofibril, and the myofibril goes the entire length of the muscle cell, the entire muscle cell shortens. That's how muscles contract and pull. They shorten with force. Now, of course, we were going from something like this to something much more overlapped. So the other thing that happens is that the muscle gets fatter, right? When you make the muscle, right, it gets fatter. It gets fatter and shorter. All right, so here are just some other images that I thought were kind of cool. Right, so again, this is my myosin, the red, the actin is my blue, and you can see here's, the sarcomeres on either side. And when they pull in the actin so that everybody is overlapping, the distance from here to here has now gotten shorter. Right, we just scooch everybody in. Okay, so sarcomere contraction then causes the whole myofibril to contract, which causes the whole muscle cell to contract. Right, so that's how our muscles contract. This is going to require ATP. This is work, all right? Obviously. It takes energy to contract muscles, and we'll come back to that later. It also generates heat as a byproduct, which we talked about is one of the functions of muscle, is to help generate heat. And the muscle, as we talked about, is going to get shorter, which allows it to pull, and fatter. Okay. So how do we tell a muscle to contract, right? How do we control this? Because this is voluntary, right? So now we know what happens in the muscle itself, but how do we send the signal to make it happen? So it's going to begin all the way up in the brain, right? So remember learning about that primary motor area or primary motor cortex in the back part of the frontal lobe of your cerebrum, way back in the nervous system a couple weeks ago? It's going to send a signal down through the spinal cord to a motor neuron sitting in the spinal cord, which is then going to send an action potential down its axon, which travels through a nerve, because remember a nerve is just a bundle of axons, out to whichever muscle you want to tell to contract. Okay, so brain to spinal cord, out via a nerve along that axon of the motor neuron, takes us to the muscle. Here's just another image that I thought was kind of nice. What I appreciate about this image is not all of the gobbledygook that you don't need to know, but to remind you that they cross, right? So if I'm going to contract a muscle on this side, it's going to be a neuron on this side of my brain. It's going to send that signal. And I like this image too. You can look at that later if you like. All right. So here is that motor neuron in my spinal cord. It's going to send its action potential down an axon through a nerve to reach my muscle. And so you'll remember at the end of an axon, we have those little frog feet, frog toes, those axon terminals. So where those axon terminals reach the muscle is called the neuromuscular junction, right? This part right here. So now we're going to zoom in on that part. So at the neuromuscular junction, Here again, we have our axon terminals, right? The action potential has come down here to this muscle cell. And you might remember that when we get to the synapse, right, there's that space. And in order to cross that space to send the nerve signal, we have to release a neurotransmitter. And you might remember that for muscle contraction, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. So the action potential is going to come down to the axon terminal. That's going to cause acetylcholine molecules to be released into the synapse. Another diagram. All right. So the acetylcholine gets released into the synapse. It binds to receptors on the muscle cell. Remember, you have to have a receptor for the neurotransmitter in order for that signal to be received. Okay, and this says excited neuron, but I'm going to say excited muscle cell instead. Okay, so once that is received, then the muscle cell gets the signal to contract. Myosin pulls the actin in, causing a contraction of the muscle. And it kind of ratchets it in like that. It's like a ratchet, ratchet, ratchet. Okay. How do we end the signal to contract? Do you remember? There are two different ways at the synapse, when we learned just about the nervous system in general. There's two different ways to turn off a signal from a neuron. Yeah?
One is the, I'm trying to, the receptor, I think it's one of the receptors, either like get recycled.
Ah, right. So it might get recycled, which was reuptake. Remember, we do that with serotonin. The axon terminals suck it back in. Or we might chew it up with an enzyme, right? So enzymatic degradation. In the case of the neuromuscular junction, this place where the nerve signals the muscle cell, it's enzymatic degradation. And the enzyme is called acetylcholinesterase, right? So it's going to chew up the acetylcholine, thus ending the signal to the muscle cell to contract, and the muscle relaxes. This happens instantaneously, right? Because I can like make a muscle contract and then like stop right away. This happens super fast, which is really pretty amazing. Okay. Let's see how well we're doing. Watch your phones. All right. So let's talk about how muscles actually get their energy, right? So they need ATP in order to do contraction. So where is that going to come from, and how do we do that? So muscles need a lot of ATP, so they have some pretty robust systems that allow them to produce it. Okay. So just so you know, ATP is required not only for muscles to contract, but also for them to relax. Okay? So we really need a lot of ATP in muscles. We have a couple of raw materials, several different types of raw materials that we can use. We're going to go through these. The most commonly used one is glucose, right? That's our blood sugar floating around in the bloodstream. So from the bloodstream, we can pull glucose into muscle cells, right? And we've talked about how mitochondria use glucose and oxygen to make ATP. We're going to go into that a little bit more in depth today. So glucose is a preferred raw material for making ATP. But if there's none around, or not much around, we can use fatty acids instead. And remember, fatty acids are the subunits of lipids, right? So we all have fatty acids circulating in our bloodstream as well. Inside the muscle cell, we also have some storage forms of these molecules that we pack up for a rainy day. So muscle can also store glycogen. And you might remember way back when we talked about the digestive system that that's one of the functions of the liver as well, to take extra glucose and package it into glycogen and store it in the liver. But not only can the liver make and store glycogen, but the muscle tissue themselves, the muscle cells themselves, can take extra glucose, package it into glycogen, and store it in the muscle cells for a rainy day, for when you really need it. So again, when somebody carb loads before a big event, right? They're increasing their blood glucose so that both their liver and their muscles will maximize their storage of glycogen, right? Just packing it in. Muscle can also store fatty acids as triglycerides. So remember, fatty acids are the subunits of triglycerides. So it will also do that, right? Here's a fatty acid, this is a triglyceride. You just hook a bunch of them together. So we can do that. It's not the preferred energy source, but we can. All right. So mechanism for making ATP number 1. This is the one that our muscles use most of the time, is aerobic cellular respiration. This is the same thing we've been talking about all semester. This is the whole reason that we breathe air, right? To bring oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take usually glucose, although we can use fatty acids in a pinch, and combine it with oxygen. We're going to do this huge series of chemical reactions that involves the mitochondria and end up producing quite a lot of ATP, actually. We will also produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct, as well as some water. Okay? So this is the entire reason we breathe oxygen in, and the entire reason that we need to exhale carbon dioxide out. This is because of aerobic cellular respiration. This is the process by which most of our cells make their ATP most of the time, right? That then allows us to do cellular work. So this system is actually pretty robust. It makes a lot of ATP. Approximately 36 molecules of ATP per round of aerobic cellular respiration. Varies a little bit depending on some factors, but about 36 molecules of ATP. Very productive. Now, it has some drawbacks, however. It's not ideal for all situations. It is relatively slow. It takes time for this to happen, right? So if I'm just going to do, some movement, that's fine. If I'm going to move really fast, then I'm going to need too much ATP too quickly. So sometimes this is going to fail us because it's relatively slow. It also requires mitochondria to do it. So you have to have a mitochondria who's free and is like, oh yes, I can step up and make some ATP for you. I'm not busy making ATP already for you. And it requires quite a bit of oxygen. Right? Now the oxygen is being delivered to the cells by the bloodstream, of course, diffusing out from the capillaries down its concentration gradient from the blood out into the tissues. But you can only get so much blood flow to the muscles so quickly. So if you're needing to use a lot of ATP really fast, sometimes this method doesn't work that well for you. So thank goodness we have 2 others that we can rely on. Fermentation. So if we don't have enough oxygen, or if the mitochondria are busy still working on their 36 ATP, but they're not done yet, but I need some ATP now, I will do fermentation. So this doesn't require oxygen, and it doesn't require mitochondria. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a glucose molecule, I'm going to do some chemical reactions that will allow me to produce some ATP. But it is also going to produce some lactate as a waste product. You know this as lactic acid. So it's really fast, which is awesome. It doesn't require oxygen, and it doesn't require mitochondria. Also awesome. So if you're not available, this is a great go-to, right? But it only makes 2 ATP. So remember, aerobic cellular respiration needs 36. Okay. Only makes 2. And then it creates lactic acid. So when you feel the burn, right, when you're doing wall sits, right, and after a while, you just really feel that burning in your quadriceps muscles, that's because all your mitochondria are busy trying to make ATP. They're all doing their best to churn it out, but it's not coming quickly enough to continue to keep contracting this muscle to keep you in this position. So now you're having to do fermentation, which is giving you quick bursts, quick fast bursts of small amounts of ATP, but it's also creating lactic acid. So when you start to feel that burn, right? That's what you're feeling. You're feeling acid buildup in your muscle, right? You're actually feeling that lactic acid, right? So you know that you have exceeded your body's capacity to deliver oxygen to the muscle cells and to have enough mitochondria around that aren't otherwise busy to turn it into ATP. All right, so that's method number 2. Muscle is so fancy and so important that it actually has a third way to make ATP as well, and that is the creatine phosphate pathway. So what is creatine? Well, from a chemical standpoint, it's a nitrogen-containing acid, okay? So that's what it is from a molecular standpoint. It's not terribly interesting. But what is interesting about it is that it's present in food, so you can eat it, right? It's kind of like a nutrient, but your body can also make it, right? So your liver and kidneys are both capable of making creatine. So you do not have to eat it, ever. Right? As long as you're getting enough of the different amino acids that we need to build all the molecules we need in our body, you do not need to eat creatine. Right? It's present in the foods you eat for one, and if you're not getting enough in your foods, your body will just make it. So once your body makes it or you absorb it from what you eat, it moves through the blood and gets stored in the muscles. And what the muscles do when they're at rest is they're going to take some phosphate groups, which is just a chemical description of a phosphate and some oxygens, and stick it onto the creatine and turn it into creatine phosphate. Right? So you can think of this like charging up a rechargeable battery. Okay? Sticking phosphate onto a creatine to make creatine phosphate is charging a rechargeable battery. Because that's going to allow us to do something pretty cool. All right, so don't pay attention to the words up here for just now. So I have this creatine phosphate, right, at my charged battery because I stuck a phosphate on it. I can use that phosphate to throw it onto an ADP molecule to make ATP. And then I'll go back to creatinine, which is where I started from, right? And I can produce one ATP, but it's super fast, and it requires nothing other than a creatine phosphate. It doesn't require oxygen, doesn't require mitochondria to be available to do the work for you. And there's no waste product. There's no lactic acid buildup when you use just the creatine phosphate pathway. Okay. So this can be really useful when you need really short, intense bursts of muscular activity. Right? It's too intense for the mitochondria to be able to meet the need quickly enough through aerobic cellular respiration. Right? So this can be very helpful in certain limited situations. Weightlifters, right? They need for a short time a lot of energy to power that one. Sprinters, right? Not marathon runners. Right? That's long endurance. This isn't going to make much of a dent. It's only one ATP. Yeah. What is ADP? Yes, well, ADP is the precursor molecule to ATP. It stands for adenine diphosphate, and we just turn it into adenine triphosphate by adding another phosphate. You don't need to know that. I just couldn't think of a good way to kind of like teach this without having that sitting there. But it's the raw material that we turn into ATP, if that helps. All right. So overall, when we look at the different ways that muscles can make ATP, right? Aerobic respiration, aerobic cellular respiration is like the big kahuna. Like that's what we use most of the time. It's very powerful. Right? But it requires oxygen. It requires mitochondria. But look at all these ATP, 36. It's relatively slow, but it's diverse. It can use glucose or fatty acids as a source material. It does produce carbon dioxide as a waste. Yeah.
So it's like distance running.
Yes.
You have to eat like food.
Yep. Absolutely. So with distance running, right, and why people doing distance running will have those little gels and other things to eat, right, is because you're using glucose and maybe fatty acids to power you, to power your mitochondria to do this, to maintain that activity, that high level activity for a long period of time. The glycogen stores in your muscles will run out. Right? And that's what you then break down into glucose inside the muscle cell. So that's why people then take those gel supplements as they're running to restore glucose, get more glucose into the body because they've used up all they use up all your stores.
Like during marathons, instead of just water, they'll have like a certain mixture.
Right. Yep. Instead, right, during marathons, instead of just plain water, that's one of the reasons why they have Gatorade. Gatorade has sugar in it. That's good for you when you're needing to make a lot of ATP. Remember, Gatorade also has electrolytes in it. It also has sodium in it. Do you remember why? Why don't you want to drink too much water? Right? Because it's hypotonic, right? And via osmosis, it can cause excess water to move inside your cells and they can swell and lyse. Right? So that's why you can die for drinking too much water. Yeah. Right. So that's why Gatorade is a better bet. Absolutely. Okay. All right. So aerobic cellular respiration is our big kahuna, but then we have our two backups. So fermentation doesn't require oxygen or mitochondria, makes 2 ATP, it's fast, uses glucose, but generates lactic acid as a byproduct. Feel the burn. Yeah?
So the lactic acid what causes your muscles to be really sore the day after a workout?
Ooh, why their muscles are sore the day after workout. That's called delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS. And last I looked, it was not totally well understood exactly why that happens. I'll check again to see if there's been something new since the last time I looked, but they were still trying to figure it out last time I looked. All right, and then finally we have the creatine phosphate pathway. Not very powerful, but super fast, and it doesn't create any waste products that you have to deal with, right? So it can give you a little extra oomph if you need really fast, all of a sudden, power, right? A big burst of power. So, do creatine supplements work? Are they actually helpful in improving people's athletic performance? So you're like, I don't know, I don't want to say because I don't want to get it wrong. So a couple things. One is our bodies can make their own creatine. So even if I don't take any creatine supplements, even if I don't eat any creatine-containing foods, I will have creatine inside my muscles. I do right now, I'm sure of it. Okay? What taking extra will do, it's a small enough molecule, it will diffuse across the membrane. You take a big load of it, you absorb it into your bloodstream, because that's what your digestive system does. It absorbs whatever you put into it, if it can. So you will temporarily have a lot of creatine in your bloodstream. Some of that will then diffuse out into your muscle cells, right? Down its concentration gradient. So you can temporarily, for a short period of time, kind of hack your muscle cells and increase the amount of creatine that's present in your muscle cells for a length of time. Then, over the course of the next 24 hours, it's going to move back out of the muscles. Your kidneys are going to pee it out. They're like, what's all this creatine here for? And you're just going to pee it out. So that's why if you know somebody who takes creatine supplements, they take them every single day. Because you just get this transient, temporary effect of increased creatine in the muscle cells. So can they be helpful? Yes. In the short term while you have extra creatine in your muscle cells. Yeah. Right. So this is an issue that I need to do a lot more research on. This idea that when you're training your muscles, you need to work them so hard that you end up injuring the muscle cells. And that so my question would be, is there such a thing as breaking it down in a healthy way? Right? If you're breaking the muscle, if you're exceeding its capacity to maintain its wholeness, right? Is it just a question of degree then? Right? So this idea that you have to work out so hard to injure your muscle, to cause your muscle cells to break, to then get increased strength, is an idea that has kind of taken hold in the fitness world. And last I checked, which was a year ago, I need to look again, there wasn't a lot of evidence to support that. What I have found is some studies in animals, not yet to be replicated in humans, that if you overload a muscle, right, so you ask it to do more than it can do, significantly, the muscle cell itself seems to split. And they don't know why that's significant, but they're hypothesizing that perhaps then, instead of having this one singular tubular cell, now you've kind of created a branched cell, that maybe now each of those branches is going to grow and develop and become a big cell. And maybe that increases your muscle strength. That was the latest hypothesis I had seen. Last I looked, I couldn't find any human studies that actually looked at, like, okay, if you exercise to the point of like, okay, that's it, I'm done, versus, oh, now I'm really done, right? So kind of the like standard exercise versus the CrossFit model or whatever, right? Do you actually get significant increased gain in strength? I can find no human studies that actually look at that question. To me, as a medical person, I'm like, injuring a muscle just doesn't sound like a good idea, right? It's just like, why? Then your body has to spend energy and resources on repair. But there's this idea that if you kind of rip it apart a little bit, when you repair it somehow, then it's going to be stronger. And there's a couple of other hypotheses about why that might happen, but I still haven't found any actual data to support it. But I'll look again, because it's a really interesting question, and it certainly has taken on a life in the fitness community for sure. As things often do, right? But creatine actually does have human studies to back up that, yes, it will improve your performance for anaerobic activities, so intense bursts of muscular activity in the short term. Absolutely, it does.
Is there a way to, I guess, calculate how much ATP it takes to do a certain activity?
A way to calculate how much ATP it takes to do a certain activity. I tried to do that once. And it's like millions and millions and millions and millions of molecules of ATP that we use in just a single day. And I got overwhelmed with scientific notation. It's a lot, and it's hard. Because we're using tons of molecules of ATP within each individual cell all day long. It's kind of crazy. All right. Let's talk a little bit about response to training, which kind of that question kind of led us into a little bit as well. So what do we know for sure about what happens with repeated exercise over time? Okay, so I'm not talking about if I start doing some jumping jacks right now, that response to exercise, not in that immediate short term. I'm talking long term, right? Response to training, right? A regular exercise regimen. What is that doing in the muscle? All right, two main things. Number one is if you're repeatedly asking a muscle to do work, especially if you're kind of getting it up to its limit, right? And I'm not sure about going past its limit. It will increase the number of myofibrils inside the muscle cells, right? So you will grow new myofibrils, which are made of actin and myosin. So it's as if, I started with a muscle cell that was this big around, And then I worked out a whole bunch. And so then my muscle cell grows some more new myofibrils. And so now it's bigger, fatter, right? It's wider because it has more things inside of it. And since those myofibrils are what are doing the pulling of the muscle, it's stronger. It's capable of doing more work, right? It's like having more people on your tug of war, right? I've got more myofibrils in there to help pull. So increasing the number of myofibrils inside a muscle increases its strength, right? Its ability to exert force, and also increases its size. The other thing that is going to happen, especially if I keep exercising to the point where I feel the burn, so I keep exceeding my capacity to do aerobic cellular respiration, in response to that, the cell is going to make more mitochondria. Right? Because it's going to say, jeepers, we need more of these guys. Right? You keep getting them, they're all swamped, they're working overtime, and having to do fermentation, that's generating lactic acid, which is a pain to deal with. So you're going to make more mitochondria, which improves your capacity to do more aerobic cellular respiration. So you can make more ATP more quickly, because you have more little ATP factories, right, to make those 36 kahunas. Yeah.
Would that also then increase your rate of metabolism?
Absolutely. So your rate of metabolism, your metabolism is basically how many chemical reactions you're doing. So yes, anything that increases the activities you're doing increases your metabolic rate in the moment. Now, also, when you increase a cell's size by increasing the myofibrils, just maintaining that tissue takes more energy. So people who are bigger, especially if they have more of the tissues that require a lot of maintenance, like muscle, have a higher metabolic rate. They need more energy just at baseline than people who are littler. Assuming that those little people aren't children who are growing, they need a lot. All right, so Damon, you're up. Okay, so Damon here does push-ups as part of his workout for track. I abhor push-ups. Okay, so come on up on the stage. All right, so we're going to do a push-up contest. I'm going to do wimpy girl knee push-ups. Sorry, wimpy knee push-ups. All right, because I got to tell you, I have not been doing push-ups as much as Dean has. So I do not have as many myofibrils inside my muscle cells as he does. Right? So I get to cheat. Right? But we're going to see who can go longer and how many we can do. So Maggie, you're going to count how many push-ups I do. Okay? And Paula, you're going to count how many push-ups Damon does. Okay? All right. So here we go. I'll give you that. All right. Mark, set, go. You feel any burning yet? I haven't exceeded my mitochondrial capacity. So I'm now doing fermentation, which is giving me this 22 ATP, and it is making things really hurt. And, okay, let's stop there. All right. Stop. How many did I do? How many? 17. How many did he do? 22. 20. All right, let's give him a round of applause. Thank you, David. All right. Do your muscles not hurt? No. Right? Mine hurt. I don't have as many mitochondria in my muscles because I haven't been training. Right? So that is one of the reasons that you train. Increase your strength and increase your endurance, right? Your ability to make lots of ATP, because you have lots of mitochondria around to do the work of making those big payoffs, those big payloads of 36 ATP. So I'm also a little out of breath because I also accumulated an oxygen debt. In order to deal with that lactic acid, now I need to use oxygen to do some stuff in my liver to take care of it. right? So it's going to take me a while to get back to kind of like my resting respiratory rate, right? So that's what oxygen debt is, which you've probably learned about. All right, questions about this much? Oh yeah, what was our time? 31.22 seconds. All right, 31 seconds. I haven't done 17 push-ups in a long time now. I'm feeling very proud of myself. All right. So, any other questions about muscles? So I have one other thing I want to go over with you today. All right. Oh, the other thing I want to say is the other reason you train is, do you remember that part in the frontal lobe of your brain that codes for sequences of complex physical actions, right? So I can do this, right? That's the other reason why you train, is that muscle memory, that programming in the frontal lobe of your brain to make things automatic, right? If I'm going to try to throw a basketball and hoop, I have to like think about everything, right? I don't have that training up in my brain. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is to answer Damon's question from the other day. What is carpal tunnel syndrome? So remember earlier today, we talked about how the muscles that bend your fingers are located in your forearm, here on this surface of your forearm, okay? And so the muscle is here, and then the tendon goes through here all the way out to my fingers. There's just not enough room in your hands for very many muscles. The only muscles in your hands are the ones that do this. All the other muscles that work your fingers, with the exception of the thumb, are in your forearm. So all of these tendons have to scoot from the forearm out into the hand, out to all the different fingers. So this is a cross section here. So it's like, so if I cut my wrist, what you can see is the bones of the wrist, which are called the carpal bones. You can feel those here, right? They're on this side. And then all of those tendons have to go through this little space between those bones and a thick band of connective tissue right here. In that tunnel, the carpal tunnel, also travels a nerve. So remember, a nerve is a bundle of axons, the median nerve. And the median nerve carries axons that give sensation to this shaded blue part of the hand, so sensory axons for this part of the hand, and motor axons that power the muscles right here that act on the thumb, these muscles here. So what can happen is if you're doing a lot of repetitive motion with your fingers, right, like typing, that's flexing. I'm using these muscles right here, right? These tendons are sliding. I don't know if you can see, like I can see that. Can you see that when you make a fist? Can you see those tendons pulling and sliding in your forearm, right? They have to glide back and forth. And if you overwork them, they can get swollen. And if they get swollen and inflamed, then this nerve starts getting pinched. So repetitive activities of the fingers is one of the most common causes of carpal tunnel syndrome. The other thing that can do it is a lot of people tend to sleep like this, right, with their wrists like this. And you may not even realize you're doing it, tucked up underneath your pillow there, right? And so that puts a lot of pressure on the same spot. So if you compress a nerve, it can't function well. So if you're compressing that median nerve that travels through the carpal tunnel, you get tingling and numbness or sometimes shooting pain of these fingers, because that's the sensory axons that travel through that nerve. And if it lasts long enough, you can actually end up getting weakness of this muscle because you have trouble getting the motor axon signals to this muscle. And muscles are use it or lose it. If you can't send signals to it, you can't contract it, it will get weak and smaller in time. So that is carpal tunnel syndrome. So it's kind of the skeleton and the muscular system and the nervous system all together. Yeah?
So what about, I guess, tendonitis? Because that's one on itself.
So tendinitis is inflammation of a tendon itself. Okay, so there's lots of different common places for tendinitis, but it's usually, again, due to overuse, right? Repetitive motion, doing the same thing really frequently, or overusing a muscle. Yep, just pulling on that tendon too much.
All my nerve issues and my hands are a combination of carpal tunnel, cubital tunnel, so my
Yeah.
nerve,
Yep.
and tendinitis. So I sleep with a brace at night.
There you go. Yep. That helps. All right. Other questions for me today? Okay, so I will be here next Tuesday to talk about the reproductive system. If you are not here next Tuesday, I will miss you, right? But hopefully you will be here. If you are not here, it will get recorded like we usually do and posted as usual. Don't forget to do the quiz due this Sunday. Have a great day.